Hello, and welcome to Season 14, Episode 8 of Unlimited Opinions. I'm Adam Bishop.
Hello, I'm Mark Bishop.
We are, of course, reading Russell Kirk's The Conservative Mind, this time talking about Chapter 8, Conservatism with Imagination, Disraeli and Newman. Now, it's been like a week since I last read this. We didn't have time to record last week with it being Easter, but I read the chapter for last week, so it might take some reminding of what exactly was discussed in this chapter. I remember I really enjoyed the discussion on Newman. I'm a
Yeah,
big fan of Newman, who's now Saint John Henry Newman since the time this book was published. Section of Disraeli I thought was fine. Wasn't as interested in him as a thinker. I think Newman is really, really great. I thought the section here was really great as well.
yes, I agree. And I think Newman has been underappreciated in my lifetime.
Hmm.
Um, and mostly that I think his influence now, his legacy, are these Newman centers or these college campuses are all across the country, which
Yeah.
are really starting to bear fruit. They didn't have a Newman Center at UMSL
Mm.
when I went, but they didn't have much of anything at UMSL. It was a commuter school, so no one. I mean, it was when class was not in session, it was abandoned.
Hmm.
There was no one there. It was closed, and they didn't have any residential halls or anything, and
Hmm.
so the empty parking lot and locked buildings.
Yeah. Well,
Um,
I
yeah.
think Newman still has influence. He was kind of almost in some ways a grandfather to Tolkien,
Hmm.
because one of the priests that was directly under him was actually his confessor and traveled around with him for the last couple years of Newman's life. That was the priest that raised Tolkien. And
Yeah.
his brother growing up, and so they were part of the Oratorians, this
Yeah.
religious group that really was founded by Newman, or not founded by Newman, but Newman had great influence over like the English Oratorians in the style of Saint Philip Neri. So Tolkien was very much influenced by Newman, I think somewhat indirectly, but very much sort of growing up in a very Newmanite sort of philosophy.
Numenite.
Newmanite, yeah, that's
Uh,
the adjective for Newman.
is it really? Is that
Yeah,
something that's commonly
Newmanite, yeah,
used?
that's it's Newmanite, yeah. Because otherwise
Hmm.
it'd be like Newmanian or
Yeah.
Newmanic, I don't know, Newmaniac. I don't know, and that just sounds weird.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Maniac. I'd like to be a new maniac. Yeah, and I think Newman got out while the getting was good.
Hmm.
The Anglican Church, and there have been a lot of people that came over from the Anglican Church. I remember when I was in my 20s, and my dad had, I'd moved out, and my dad was telling me about an Anglican priest
Hmm.
who had come over, and he was married
Hmm.
with some kids, a couple of kids, and he converted, and he was a Catholic priest. I guess they allow that. I don't know.
Hmm.
And so he said it was so much different, like going to confession or even just talking to the guy, because he could relate.
Hmm.
When he's talking about the wife and kids and that kind of stuff, and he really enjoyed it. My dad was pretty much a traditionalist, you know, but he spoke very highly of this particular
Yeah.
priest.
There's a guy down
Yeah,
here actually that's a convert from Anglicanism. Same thing. Anglican priest, had a family, converted to Catholicism. Now works for UF. I don't think he's the dean of the business school, but he's like an assistant
oh,
dean. Like he's like higher up in the administration.
yeah,
And so his like actual day job isn't with the parish, but he
yeah,
says masses somewhat regularly.
yeah.
But yeah, it's a fascinating dude from what I've heard of him.
Yeah, interesting. It's and I kind of go back and forth at times about whether or not priests should be able to marry,
Mm.
but it's obviously a controversial subject. But
Right.
anyway, so I don't know as far as a conservative thinker though. I mean, what do you think as far as his summary of Newman?
Hmm.
I didn't really, other than just to defend traditional, Catholic Church and the historic role of the church in Christianity and society. Um, I don't know. Do you think he made a good
Mm.
case about Newman being, really influential in conservative political thought, like as a
Mm.
conservative, you know, thinker? I don't
Yeah.
know.
Well, I think we'll have to wait to share my thoughts until we get to the section on Newman. People have to listen to the end because first is Disraeli.
Yeah,
Yes, and I like the way he sets up this chapter, like he does all the times. He kind of sets up like the villain of sorts, or sort of the
yeah.
anti-ideology to the figures he's going to talk about, and then sort of talks about how they are responding to this. Like his first sentence here, he says, two Jews introduced the new conservatism and the new radicalism, Disraeli and Marx.
Yeah.
Disraeli, who was born Jewish but then converted to Christianity, and then Marx, who was just kind of his own thing.
He's
Um,
an atheist, don't you think?
yeah. Oh, yeah.
Mark.
Marx. Yeah. 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 But in terms of like philosophy, right, sort of starting all of this Marxism, well, I guess he's sort of a Hegelian, but talking about sort of Disraeli as sort of the opposite of Marxism, or really Marxism is sort of the bogeyman, of this time in Victorian England. Um, and he says, page 228, he says, yet it is exaggeration to speak of Disraeli as if conservative ideas in Victorian times were sustained entirely by his fervid and Baroque imagination. He did indeed resurrect Toryism as a political movement, saving it from amalgamation with utilitarian liberalism. So a couple of weeks back, the reason why we're talking about him as a sort of conservative figure was this sort of looming threat of utilitarianism, especially in England. And it seems like Disraeli is the one who kind of puts the Tory party or Toryism in sort of opposition to a utilitarian movement, which it very easily could have become.
Um, have you ever seen the movie John Wick?
I've seen some of them. I've seen the first one.
The first one, yeah. Anytime anybody mentions the boogeyman, I
Mm,
automatically I can't help myself think about John Wick. He's he's not really the boogeyman. He
mm.
is the man you sent to kill the boogeyman. The Baba Yaga.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I also like the timeline he sets up because I didn't realize. I mean, I guess I knew this, but didn't really realize how close in time they were. On page
Yeah.
229, it says in 1848, when Marx and Engels issued the Communist Manifesto, Disraeli was assuming the leadership of the Tory Party, and Newman, at the Oratory in Birmingham, was on the eve of his struggle to establish a Catholic university in Dublin. In 1867, when the first volume of Capital appeared, Disraeli effected his reform, and Newman was halfway between the Apologia Provita Sua and a Grammar of Assent. So all
Mm,
three of these careers are very much happening at the same time. And I've never really thought about Newman in connection with Marx
yes.
in such a way, but they are just absolute contemporaries, and sort of their
Yeah.
whole intellectual history is happening at the same time as each other.
Yeah, it's funny because like I said at the beginning, do I really think that he's a conservative political thinker? But like every time you read about Newman, you're reading about him in the context of Catholic and his
Hmm.
conversion and religious history. And yeah, I didn't even think about that either until I read this. Like, yeah, I guess they were, they probably lived pretty close to each other too. I mean, relatively. I mean,
Yeah,
they're the same part of the world, same country,
right.
and the same era. It's wild how for all of Marx's faults, and there are many,
Hmm.
to have those kind of really historical, influential people, that being Newman and Marx, coming out of the same country, same town,
Hmm.
really, I guess.
Right, right,
Large respect, at the same time, it's just amazing.
right.
Completely divergent opinions about God and morality and the role of the church and the state and all that kind of stuff. It's
Hmm.
fascinating.
Yeah. I do like how he tries to set up there is some connection between all three of these thinkers, sort of towards the bottom of 229, because he says what was lacking in liberals was higher imagination, right? Going for facts, right? Pure utilitarian,
Yeah,
sort of ordered facts.
right.
And what he argues is, well, Marx goes beyond that, right? Sort of constructing this theory of history that does appeal to the imagination, that gives sort of more of a purpose to things, that is more than just sort of utilitarian, very logical
Yeah.
drive. He's very much using sort of utilitarian principles and sometimes, or methods in some ways, but his sort of overall philosophy speaks to something different. So he kind of argues that all three of these are trying to capture the imagination of thinkers in different ways, rather than just sort of this washed out sort of utilitarian thinking.
Yeah. And one of the things that makes Marx's um, philosophy is so compelling is that he recognizes that men are not equal, and but he makes an argument that the government needs to equalize everything, and that's
Right,
really the danger of it.
right.
So well, why are these guys getting, that they have an unfair advantage, and so you have to use the state to equalize everything, and so he's not. Uh, of the same mind as the people who say, well, we're all the same,
Hmm.
and we are all born with the same morality and the same benefits and the same capacities. Marx at least acknowledges, that some people are born with advantages. and then but he wants to level it out.
Hmm.
And of
Yeah.
course, the moral level. Who was it that really articulated this so well? If it was Victor Davis Hanson or somebody else, maybe that talked about how the fatal flaw in that whole line of thinking of having the government help with creating equality is that you have to have exponentially increasing levels of force
Mm.
to level it out. Um, the closer you get to equality, maybe it was Jordan Peterson actually, because it's one thing to have equality of rights and being treated under equally under the law, but when you start getting the trying to figure out the equality of outcome, you can change the big disparities, like the super poor and the super wealthy. You can
Hmm.
you can deal with those without too much force. Basically, what we do now, we tax the wealthy.
Right.
We don't tax, or we have direct cash payments essentially, especially the earned incomes tax credit and other benefits. But then as you get closer and closer to leveling that out, you have to have ever increasing use of force
Hmm.
to compel that forced equality on more and more people. And really, what you end up doing is just suppressing everything down. And of course, Marxists don't believe in the rising tide lifts all boats. They want to sink the big boats, and then we're all just in these little rowboats. uh, but anyway, so I just thought that was well described well by the author on page 130 when he
Hmm.
mentions, men are not equal by nature. The socialists must level them by legislation and economic device. And that was, that's really the heart of Marxism, I think, and
Right.
the dangers of Marxism.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. I don't have too much else to say about Marx. I think you kind of captured the whole thing. So kind of moving into Disraeli, unless you had any other points you wanted to make there.
Let's see. I did have one other quote. On 232, he's talking about Marx.
Mm.
He says, the vast majority of men always have been poor, but perhaps never since the triumph of Christianity had they been so bored and hopeless, condemned to monotonous labor in the grimiest and grittiest of hideous towns, and a milieu philosophically dedicated to material success and moral individualism.
Mm.
Just thought that was a really good summary of the criticism of what was pretty much unfettered capitalism and the Industrial Revolution, where people are in these grimy and polluted and dangerous, quite frankly, factories. And
Hmm.
then you have the moral individualism also coming in at that same time. And it was a tough life, with child labor and unending hours and no right to collectively bargaining and none of those legal protections for employees that we have now.
Hmm.
It was a tough slog, and it makes and when you remember that, it makes so much more sense why Marx could be popular in that
Right.
system. The system was really brutal for those that were laborers. It was
Yeah.
hard to get out of
Yeah. Absolutely.
it.
Absolutely. Yeah. No,
So
I enjoyed that quote
what do you
too.
have to say about Disraeli? I mean, he fought for conservative ideas, but
Hmm.
and I know he was, I've seen him referenced in other people to say that he was influence on people, but I wasn't blown away with the summary of him, as a great conservative political thinker, a
Hmm.
tactician, that type of thing. I
Yeah.
don't know, something I was missing.
Um, I think, one of the points here on the bottom of page 234, sort of again contrasting it with Marx, he says, either propounded a theory of classes. Marx insisted that warfare among classes is inevitable, and time must be catastrophic, and will end with the absorption of all classes into the proletariat, establishing a classless society. Disraeli declared that the real interests of classes are not inimical, that they are bound together in the
Right.
nation's welfare, and his aim in politics was the reconciliation of classes. Right, a union of vindication and restoration of class, not its abolition. Class's order, without order, law crumbles. So very
Yeah.
much it seems carrying in that same strain as Burke, like we've talked about throughout all of this, right? Recognizing that there are differences and the differences can be good. Really, the job of the statesman isn't to level out differences, but to provide unity and order in the face of these differences, or have all of these different classes work together towards the same goal.
Yeah.
Right. And it seems like he is using this sort of in a more idealistic way, maybe than some of the others we thought about, in this more romantic way of sorts, right? Sort of combating both the liberalism and sort of the Marxism that just, either want to go to facts or this sort of theory of history, but saying, no, there's just something good about England. It seems to be a lot of what he's talking about here.
Right. Right. And I've often thought of and talked about, like the appeal of Trump is not, is his view of things not being race but class. That he appeals to the working class and that sort of cohort in America. But of course, in England at this time, when Disraeli was there, they actually had an aristocracy. They had lords, and they had a more formal setup. Um, but I have a hard time defining. I feel like there's a couple different classes of people in the United States, but I don't know that anybody really defines them.
Hmm.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
but I feel like there are. Like there's a super no, I mean not super wealthy, but the wealthy, politically engaged, primarily left wing, bi-coastal type people. I think they have a different class than us. Like
Mm.
they have like almost a subculture
Hmm.
of America. They talk very similar manner. You can tell somebody who's part of that by they have like that up with an uptick on the end of their sentences,
Hmm.
where the inflection at the end, and they all go to the same schools, they read the same stuff, and they talk about the same politics, and then you have a criminal underclass, which is not necessarily racial, but there's like something, that there's a different kind of sense of morality and justice, um, in what I call the criminal underclass, in various parts of the country, and you have like the working class and middle class, and then I don't know, but there's so much overlap, and they're not
Hmm.
there's no geographic differences, and there's no formal tie, there's no ticket into any of them.
Right.
It's like you can be born in one and end up in the other, or vice versa. But I think I do appreciate what Disraeli and others were saying, that because they had more formal classes, but there are differences in groups,
Hmm.
and different kind of, like, I think they're like subcultures within society. Um, because like they're like, even like among Trump supporters, like there's of course, maybe I'm just aware of them more in my area, but it's like, um, the trailer park Trump supporters. And I don't mean that in a disparaging way. They're great people, and they're usually like, well, certainly lower middle class, and they live in, more often than not, single wide trailers, which is a real demarcation line of affluence, and they have a certain culture.
Hmm.
I can talk fluent to them, about politics or religion, and they're almost always evangelical, non-denominational,
Hmm.
believers, and Trump supporters almost with a religious fervor,
Yeah.
and they're their core group, in my opinion, that even if Trump completely reverses course from his previously held position, like a couple months prior, they're like, yeah, he was wrong then, he's right now. No matter.
Hmm.
It's fascinating. Anyway, so I'm sorry to go off that little
Yeah.
tangent, but
That's
I
right.
think I think there's some value to recognize that there are different cultures within, of course, British society, but also American society. But I have a hard time defining it now.
Yeah. That's one
I
of the things
feel
I noticed, both when I was back at Truman and down here at UF as well, right? Especially with Truman being just in the middle of nowhere, Kirksville, Missouri, right? As soon as you step off campus, right? It's very, very much sort of the average person is kind of the person you're describing. Some
yeah,
differences in there. It's not exactly the same. But then you also just have within the little bubble of campus, it's a different class of people, right? It's just a different culture of people, that the
Yeah.
students and the professors. Same thing to a certain extent down here. It's a little different, big SEC school and things like that. So it's a little bit more across the entire spectrum. You see that.
Yeah.
If I go 15 minutes outside of town, I see the exact communities that you're talking about, right? If you're in the heart of campus, you would imagine that those are, hundreds of miles away,
Mhm.
right? And it's just two entirely different worlds that kind of just exist right next to each other. And
Yeah.
I think you just see that all over the country.
Well, and there's a different the subculture I was talking about was a subset of the
Right.
rural vote because the vast majority of people in Kirksville, of what I know of them, tend to be farmers,
Hmm.
and actually when you get talking to any of them, not that the other ones are stupid, but you find out they're really smart, hardworking people, and like they'll be working a 9 to 5 job, but then they're also raising cattle. I mean,
Hmm.
or they have chickens, and so it's like they're working 2 jobs, but it's just normal for them. And
Right.
they have horses and all that stuff, and there's so much more dynamic and hardworking than I don't know if I could be that hardworking. Like
Hmm.
I joke. It's a running joke that I say I should have been a farmer, and
Hmm.
everybody laughs when I say it because I don't think I could ever figure it out. And I'd probably be horrible at it. And I joke, well, I could buy a book,
Hmm.
and I learn, which is itself a job. But anyway, so I think Disraeli's onto something. Of course,
Right.
they were in the context of a situation where they were denying the vote to certain classes of people, and
Right.
that's anathema
Right.
uh, to us here in the United States, especially currently.
Right. Right. Kind of going back to Disraeli here, another point sort of on his defense really of the nation on page 237. So this is another Tory sort of thinker, a Tancred, but sort of speaking in similar terms to Disraeli, says the people of this country have ceased to be a nation. They are a crowd and only kept in some rude provisional discipline by the remains of that old system which they are daily destroying. Here is the kernel of Disraeli's social theories, the idea of the nation. He says, reminded Englishmen that they're not simply an aggregation of economic units, not simply
Yeah,
soldiers in a class struggle, constitute a nation, and of that nation, the crown, the aristocracy, and the church are the guardians. Right? There's
yes,
something particular about English society that ought to remain, English to Disraeli.
yeah,
Right? We have a king, right? And we don't, really recognize the king having the same authority as he did, maybe 400 years ago, but he's still the king. That still matters for us. We still have a church, right? And you're effectively trying to destroy the church. We were just talking a couple weeks ago about the state that Anglicanism is in now. Um, and I've thought about that. Of course, I would prefer if England would, be a Catholic country, as it once was. I think it's really historically more Catholic than it is its own Anglican thing. But I'd much rather it be properly Anglican than whatever weird nonsense is happening now. Right? You know what I mean? Does that make
yeah,
sense?
100%. And we don't need to go down too much of this rabbit hole, but like King Charles is more devout Muslim than he is
Right.
Christian.
Right.
He issues statements for Muslim holidays and doesn't for
Mhm.
Easter. He's technically the head of the Anglican Church.
Yeah. I don't know if you
So,
saw
yeah.
recently on the citizenship test for becoming a citizen of the UK. One of the questions was about the fasting holidays for Muslims. Which one of these holidays I think concludes the fasting period or begins the fasting period for Muslims? That was one of the questions on the citizenship test.
I would get that wrong. I guess
Yeah.
I'll never be a British citizen.
Yeah.
Well, I was reading, I guess a week or two ago, that I think Catholics are the largest religious group
Hmm.
practicing in England,
Yeah.
in Great Britain. Actually, I should say England.
I think it's among certain age groups, or maybe this is new statistics, but I know especially among young British people, that's definitely the case. I think the
well,
older ones, it might
yeah,
still be majority Anglican, but
I don't know. I mean, as far as practicing,
mm,
like
mm,
a statistic was, maybe go to church in the last month or so. It was limiting to people that actually did something. It didn't just say they were Catholic.
hmm.
They ask a follow-up, but it was close. It was like, but they're both super low, as a percentage of the population. So we may have you may have your wish of a Catholic
Yeah.
Great Britain,
Well,
uh,
I've just
but
just Googled
but
it
the
really quick. Catholics outnumber Anglicans 2 to 1 among young people, British born, and they're set to outnumber Anglicans in Britain. I think this is the statistic you were talking. This is from April of last year,
Okay.
of like regularly church going, 34% Anglican, 31%
Okay.
Catholic, and the
All right.
Catholic is increasing at a much faster rate. I think the Anglican is decreasing.
So I was slightly wrong, but it's kind of an amazing statistic,
Right,
that
right.
that close, and especially the youth angle of it. Because I
Hmm.
mean, why would anybody who's young become an Anglican? I mean, they
Yeah.
lost their purpose of
Hmm.
existence. It's like, it's like I'm a member of the Elks. If they didn't have a building
Hmm.
and a place to have activities, it's like, well, why am I paying dues to the Elks? We don't do anything. That's why I stopped being a member of the local Rotary Club.
Mm,
Partly because of schedule, I guess mostly because of schedule. But part of it was like, well, what do we even do?
yeah.
We get together, we shoot the breeze once a week, and I don't know, or yeah, once a week, and if you lose that goal, that purpose, okay, what we have to be doing something together, and I just think that the Anglican Church is just gobbledygook mishmash.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah.
so what else do we want to say about that? I don't think we need to. I don't know if there's anything else you want to talk about Disraeli or the
Yeah, I
his.
don't have too much else to say, except that Russell Kirk does give him a lot of credit for sort of just holding England together in sort of this age of reform. I know he mentions that on 240. He says that alone among the great powers of the earth, Britain had experienced no revolution or civil war throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. This is a magnificent conservative achievement, the work of Disraeli, who taught a confused and almost ruined party the principles of Bolingbroke and Burke and Coleridge.
Yeah,
And I think there is some truth to that is that idea of the nation that is what single-handedly prevents civil war or revolution more than anything else, right? If you just
right.
have some sort of common unity, you can figure out the problems that you're facing,
Yes,
and still remain united and
right.
not think that you have to change the entire structure of everything, right? You really just have to have that unity.
Yeah, and you see that um, in issues large and small in America. And that's a problem. It's a huge problem, actually. Like here locally in our town, there's a big issue about a data center, which are the
Hmm.
hot topic now. And there were some incumbents that were up for reelection. They all got crushed. It was like 2 to 1. All four of the council members that were up for reelection, they've been on the council for many years, were voted out. It was like 60-something% to 30-something.
Wow.
So it was, and I was surprised by the margins because they were, well known as far as I know, well-liked people, but this data center thing was pretty controversial, and there was complaints about transparency and all that stuff process. But there were also like these comments about, well, they must be taking bribes. Like, well,
Mm.
you can't. Why are you saying that?
Hmm.
Just because they disagree with you doesn't mean they're on the take. I
Right.
mean, if they all of a sudden got wealthy and there's any evidence of it, I'm like, I'd be 100% investigate it. But there's no suggestion of any of that happening. They believed in a particular policy proposal, and they're going forward with that. And then in other towns, it's too common. Even when people come in and make public statements, um, for them just to defame the elected officials as if they're not human. It's like, well, these people have families, and they,
Right.
they don't like to be insulted. They're just like you. If I would have said half the stuff you just said to them, you'd be attacking me, and we dehumanize the other, and I think it's a real concern.
Hmm.
It's a real concern of mine, especially this immigration issue. The opponents of immigration enforcement, I think there's a rational basis. Certainly, the Catholic Church social teaching would tend to it can support the idea of if not open borders, then you can make a rational argument to say, hey, everybody's welcome. Okay, I
Hmm.
get it. But there's also a rational argument to say no.
Hmm.
You have to have a ticket. You have to have a ticket to come in. This is limited entry. Every country is a limited entry country, and you have to have permission to enter. And that's a rational,
Hmm.
reasonable position. But the anti-ICE people, I'm just befuddled by
Yeah.
their vitriol, the hatred of Republicans,
Hmm.
uh, and the hatred of people that work to enforce the immigration laws, and it's not just about tactics. They really hate any sort of enforcement. And I worry about it because they're clearly driven mad by it, and it's hard to say, hey, we're all Americans. Let's come together and solve this problem.
Yeah.
When they're saying, you racist and murderers, and all that stuff. So.
Yeah.
Disraeli makes a good point. And I like this last line
Hmm.
when discussing him, where he says, "Here and there, Disraeli failed, but a large party succeeded in diverting the torrent of progress into the canal of tradition." So
Mm.
that's what you're saying too. That basically, hey, we have a tradition here. Let's not go crazy with all these revolutionary ideas. We have something to value in our society. Let's work within it. It sounds like, I'm not an expert in Disraeli, but from the author's summary, it sounds like that's his greatest achievement is just holding these nut jobs at bay,
Yeah.
which in and of itself is a huge value,
Yeah.
and one of the huge values of Trump is that he revealed the opponents to be who they are. It's like some of them, it's like, oh my gosh.
Hmm.
Anyway,
Yeah.
so on to Newman.
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
I think the much more interesting of the figures here.
And I think we're assuming that the listener knows who we're talking about. So this, because we mentioned how he converted, but he was
Hmm.
an Anglican bishop
Hmm.
and converted to Catholicism and
Hmm.
became a Catholic bishop
Hmm.
and
Cardinal.
archbishop,
Cardinal.
cardinal,
Yes.
yes, and wrote some very influential books. I have one,
Hmm.
and boy, it's hard to read.
It is.
It's
He's a
like
lengthy author. I've read his Apologia, which is discussion. It's Apology Pro Vita Sua, so apology for one's own life or defense of one's own life, defending his conversion to Catholicism,
yes,
and then his the idea of a university, which I think
yeah,
is really where his most political insights are,
yeah,
insofar as education is related to politics. And that was the point that I was going to get to. That I think his ideas on education, sort of the good of a society, and how you orient education really towards theology ultimately, I think is his most directly political. But
yeah,
as Kirk mentions at the beginning here, he says, but real conservatism too transcends politics.
yeah,
Sort of these opening paragraphs where he says a lot of his sort of more political work. And he says at the bottom of that first paragraph, he says, the sensitive and subtle man lived in an age, however, in which Caesar claimed the things that are God's, and so Newman spent his life in arguments and struggles abhorrent to his contemplative nature. Right, really just trying to defend the place of religion, especially Catholicism, sort of the tradition of Christianity, and what exactly that looks like sort of in the modern human life. He's a fantastic author. I think his idea of a university, I enjoyed reading that more than the Apologia. Very, very good sort of series of essays talking about the purpose of education.
yeah. I think mine is a compilation of both. I
Hmm.
believe I haven't gotten through the the first one yet, though, and it's like I read for leisure, and that takes effort
Right.
because I'm not I feel like I don't have as good of a vocabulary as I did when I was 20 years ago or 30 years ago. Or maybe it's just I never did. But I feel like I kind of have to think and translate his English into
Hmm.
modern English. Like I'm fluent in whatever I'm saying now, but when you have somebody that's really well educated and writes in such a way as to communicate with a person, people are just as educated as they are, knowledgeable. It's hard to read sometimes, and
Hmm.
he's not writing it to necessarily be really enjoyable prose. But so that's my only real criticism, which is really a criticism myself.
Yeah.
I'm just not smart enough to enjoy reading it. But I'll get
Right.
back to it sooner or later. I'm finishing books one at a time,
Yes. It's very good.
and
It's very worthwhile. But it is
yeah,
it is a difficult read in places. But I do like his mention, especially since even before his conversion, right? Newman was this very traditional figure, and he just kind of skirts around the topic a little bit here. But with the Tractarians, that Oxford movement of those people within the Anglican Church saying, "Well, hang on, we need to." Keep some of the things that like our Anglican founders believed, right? And
yeah,
sort of the sacramental life of the church, Yeah, he said the corporate and sacramental aspect of the church should reemerge, and that religion would have to find a place for feelings of beauty, antiquity, and mystery, which the ruling theology had dismissed or ignored as worldly or unprofitable or profane. So, existing in
Mm,
this time when Anglicanism was becoming much more sort of evangelical, much more
mm,
in the terms we use, low church rather than high church, saying we don't need all this sacramental theology. We can sort of do away with all that. More so, just the ideas, sort of stereotypical sola scriptura type ideas. And Newman and this group of Tractarians were really the ones advocating against that, that we need to have this more traditional idea. And of course, in defending traditional Anglicanism, he eventually realized, well, if I'm going to be defending traditional Anglicanism, if I'm defending tradition, I kind of have to go back to
right,
Catholicism because if I'm
right,
defending, well, there is a history here, there's a tradition. Where does that come from? Well, that comes from
right.
Catholicism. I can't just stop at Anglicanism. It'd only be one thing. It'd be a sort of minor thing to bring Anglicanism back to a more traditional form. My conscience is sort of guiding me towards, well, I have to go back to the tradition it came from,
Yeah,
Catholicism.
yeah, and that explanation just makes complete logical sense.
Hmm.
It's like, what is your justification for being Anglican as opposed to a Catholic? All the liturgy originated from the Catholic Church, and do you really think that the King Charles is better suited to be the leader of your church than
Mm,
Pope Leo? You know, I
yeah.
mean, there's room for improvement for everybody, but I do like, one of the things that I do like the author is focused on, maybe skipping ahead, but I'm looking at 247 at the
Hmm.
very bottom. He's making a point. He says, for secular knowledge is not the principle of moral improvement. And I think that is such a key understanding in life that no matter how much you can have all the knowledge in the world, like these AI supercomputers, these data centers and stuff. They can know everything,
Hmm.
but that doesn't mean they're more moral
Hmm.
or they have any morality. They're
Yeah.
amoral at
Yeah.
best. And so that's I think those thoughts about ethics not necessarily being related to knowledge are
Hmm.
really important
Yeah.
in the modern world.
Well, what I think Newman would say, and I think what I would say as well, is that well, they don't have any knowledge, right? The AI doesn't actually
Yes.
know anything. It's just
Right.
relaying programmed coded information to you, but there's
Yes.
no knowledge there, right? We
Right.
tend to anthropomorphize these things, but
Yes.
there's no actual knowing. And the argument he makes throughout the idea of university, and that's exactly what Kirk is talking about here, is that there's this really sort of in the 19th century, this push towards sort of physicalism and
Yeah.
materialism, right? That we kind of talked about. There's this quote from this guy, last name Peel. It says, "Useful knowledge is the instrument of their redemption. That physical and moral science rouses, transports, exalts, enlarges, tranquilizes, and satisfies the mind. Science is a neutral ground. Physical science will be even a source of consolation and pleasure at the hour of death." Right? All of these praises of just sort of like material knowledge, useful, practical knowledge.
Right.
And what Newman argues throughout the idea of a university, he says, well, all of that knowledge is worthless if you can't orient it towards something higher, if you don't have an idea of what truth is, truth which consists in really the study of God as its highest end.
Mm.
So if we have these universities, which in their name are purporting to provide a universal education, but you're only teaching this one subset of practical, useful knowledge, well, then it's not a university at all. You're
Yeah.
not actually educating these people because you're just teaching them practical knowledge to use in this one field. I don't know, we talked about that, especially what was it just last season when we were reading Closing the American Mind? Was it two seasons ago?
Yeah.
Right, and that's the same thing that we're seeing, I think, still today.
Mhm.
Right, this just praise of material knowledge, and that'll explain everything eventually. When, of course, it absolutely can't.
Yeah, and it's part and parcel of this utilitarianism too. Like
Yeah,
you could make everything into an equation, uh, and I'm maybe skipping it again at
that's right.
250. I like this line: "Utilitarianism is a philosophy of death," and I just think that is so true. Because there's nothing lively or life-inducing of that at all. It's just calculating, and it's so much related to modernism and the
Hmm.
modern left, mostly, I think. Especially with regard to, um, well, abortion, of course, but also these end of life decisions. the assisted suicide, which is really murder, and especially as it's being practiced in Canada. I mean, utilitarianism is literally a philosophy of death when it
Hmm.
comes to because the arguments for abortion that's utilitarian is just, well, this is going to be inconvenient.
Right.
Okay, well, that's true, but that doesn't really answer the question whether you should do it or not.
Hmm.
A lot difficult, you know.
Yeah. I like
Paying
the
for
the
my
the.
gas is difficult. It'd probably be easier if I shot the gas attendant in the short term.
Yeah.
I would have to
Yeah.
pay. They catch me.
Yeah.
But anyway,
Yeah. I like the second half of that quote too. He says, utilitarianism is a philosophy of death. Its morbidity is the consequence of Benthamite emphasis upon doubt.
yeah.
With Descartes, the utilitarians doubt all things in heaven and earth, and this is consummate folly. And I think that's absolutely true. It's like we just have to exist in this constant state of doubt, unless you can present me like this perfect empirical test to examine this one minute thing. Well, I can believe that. I
Yeah.
have to doubt every single other thing, and maybe if I build up enough facts, then I'll finally have knowledge. That's been something that's driving me crazy this semester. I've been reading a lot of Chomsky's
Oh yeah.
philosophical essays, and they're just miserable with his discussion of language as like a purely biological thing. There's nothing different about like sort of the mind and the body, right? We don't have to afford any sort of special status to the study of language. And he goes so far to essentially say that, like, well, all of our concepts are predetermined, evolved things, that I'm actually forming any ideas, essentially. They're just sort of innate, and I just have to assign sort of terms to the concepts that are already present. Because that's the trap he finds himself in, essentially. If language is purely biological, purely material thing in the brain that we evolved, well, then it has to be. All of the concepts have to be there, because otherwise, how would I come to know anything? And so he eventually just kind of comes to deny without saying it that there is any knowledge at all. And what we can know, if we can know anything, is only sort of through empirical test. That's exactly the same argument that Newman is arguing against here.
Um, I don't know anything about his philosophy,
Hmm.
especially philosophy of language.
Hmm.
Uh, other than I understand he's like a lefty commie or something.
Yeah.
But would he essentially equate like our use of language to like birds chirping?
He
Like
says
like
it's
a
he says
mating
it's
call,
he would say
that's
it's
more
different, but
yeah,
it's different because humans just have this sort of innate structure. So
yeah,
he's good on some things. So he was good originally, or maybe not even like good originally. He was very useful originally in the field, because before him everything was sort of behaviorist. Everything's positive and negative reinforcement, purely blank slate. Just learn everything because our parents like teach us words.
yeah,
But of course, we don't get nearly enough input for that. There has to be something innate. But of
yeah,
course, Chomsky, as a materialist, can't say that the innate thing is anything other than biology, right? There's
right,
something biological about us. There's a structure that we have evolved within our brain or within our mind, if there's a difference between the two for him, that gives us this structure for complex thought and speech innate within us purely biologically. So we don't really have like a unique human reason. He definitely doesn't believe in the soul. Whatever like sort of a unique reason we have is because it's a biological thing.
interesting. So it'd be really just a more complex, clicks and whistles, just because
Yeah.
we've evolved a more complex way of
Yes.
getting and sharing information.
Yeah. Well, he even says like language isn't really for, and I actually don't understand this part of his philosophy. He says like language isn't for communication. It's really much more of an internal thing. Because again, it's sort of innate within us, right? Communication isn't the main thing. So I don't know what he thinks the point of it is then, or if it really even has a point, but because it is such an innate biological thing, what he calls it is like intentional, not with a T, but with an S, intensional,
Oh,
intentional, like directed towards the inner
yeah,
individual. I think he also classifies under I language that essentially we just have our own I language for intentional individual and one other I word that he lumps under there. But it's like really when we're studying language, we're studying one individual's innate thing or internal language, and it doesn't really matter what we say about language more broadly. It's
yeah,
weird. It's
yeah, it
weird.
is. Um, that's wild, wild stuff.
Yes.
As
Yes.
Johnny Carson would say.
Right. But turning
It's
back
like,
to Newman, one of his other points on page 252. I like this quote from him towards the bottom. He says, "His virtue be a mastery over the mind, if its end be action, if its perfection be inward order, harmony, and peace, we must seek it in graver and holier places than libraries and reading rooms." And his point there is education at heart is a discipline, not a pleasure nor a consolation nor an alternative to idleness. Right? It's something you sort of have to live out. And the root of education is the study of theology, of virtue, religious faith. He continues on from there. But the idea of like, well, education is sort of the formation of the whole person, not just the teaching of rote facts, right? And that's something that we're really lacking, in the 19th century as Newman's writing, and especially today with our understandings of education. He says also on page 254, he says, "Liberal education brings order into an active intellect. The university can hardly hope to do more," right? Orienting sort of the mind to what is more important, to what is higher, towards virtue and towards God. That's really Newman's point that he sees in education.
It's funny, that's what the universities were set up to do, and I don't know that many of them do that now.
Yeah,
You
I
know,
think hardly any.
even focus on it or even play it lip service,
Hmm.
which is unfortunate. But it's a tough job, and it's almost impossible to do it in like a 30,000 student school.
Yeah.
Because it's too complex. It's hard to have individual instruction. I know they have a lot of staff and everything, um, but that it wasn't anticipated that a majority of the public would go to university either. It'd be people that be mostly self-selected to show interest and capacity. Not that it's not beneficial for other people to study things, but if you broaden it out too much, you kind of dilute its effectiveness, I think.
Hmm.
Uh, but anyway, all his points are well taken on that, and um, I don't know if I have anything else intelligent to say about
Yeah.
this chapter.
Yeah. I'll say one final sort of long quote here on page 256 that I appreciate. He says, "Conservative thinkers, however, ought to be judged not simply by what they failed to avert, but more by what they
Mm.
preserved. Newman has kept in the minds of innumerable professors and teachers and educated men an ideal of education which continues to struggle, sometimes with unaccustomed success, at present, he's right in the 50s, against the degradation of learning into technical training, against the intolerant secularization of universities and schools on behalf of conservative spiritual values. Into an age that staggers under the urban proletariat, its old man of the sea, so that sometimes schools are scarcely more than jails to contain children until the law allows them to work, Newman's books have preserved the concept of an education designed for liberal gentlemen without whom any society stifles." I just really appreciated that, and sort of going back to the idea of the imagination, right? Imaginative conservatism that Kirk is talking about here. I think Newman is fantastic for that, right? Saying that there's
Yeah.
more to life, more to education than just what is sort of immediately in front of you against this utilitarian secularism and liberalism, that we have to be oriented towards much more, and education has a very, very key role in that process.
Yes, that's a great pull-out quote.
Thank you. Well, I think that takes us pretty much to the end of the chapter. I don't know if you have any other thoughts.
I've got nothing else. I'm
All
empty.
right. Well, I'll just recommend as my final thought to both you and the listener that you should read some Newman. Very, very good author. And
Tried.
maybe if,
Tried.
if you're because I will say, especially one of the problems with the apology is he's kind of assumes, because they were distributed to the public, right, as a series of sort of periodicals. I don't know if that's the right term, but essays that were sort of distributed as
Pamphlet.
the
Right.
pamphlets, yes. And so he assumes that everybody knows all of these political and religious figures that he's just sort of referencing offhand. I'm
Yes.
like, I have no idea who any of these people are. And I'll say the idea of a university is probably a little more approachable. There's a little bit of that, sort of attacking different, utilitarian, education reformers and things like that. But a lot more of it is more sort of abstract and general, and can take it sort of more out of the time period a little bit.
Well, maybe I'll skip ahead and
Yeah.
then go back.
Yeah.
I'll try
There you
that.
go. There you go. All right. Well, do you have any other final thoughts for this episode?
No.
All right. Well, then this has been season 14, episode 8 of Unlimited Opinions. You can, of course, follow us on Twitter at ULMTD Opinions. I've been Adam Bishop.
I'm still Mark Bishop.